Hello, welcome to this webinar on access and participation plans. Today we're going to be talking about aims, objectives and targets. So my name is Elizabeth Garnham and I'm the Access and Participation Plan Manager, and we also have Dave Hughes here, who is our Senior Analyst and will be able to answer any queries you have about any data, etc. So this workshop is designed to be a practical training opportunity. We're going to talk about how you may address your aims, objectives and targets. It's not a policy briefing, so we suggest that you read the policy lines that we have put forward in Regulatory Notice 1, which is the Access and Participation Plan Guidance, in particular Part C, which details the contents of a plan. So this webinar is a repeat of the workshop we put on in London recently. There were some practical activities in that workshop. We have left those practical activities in this webinar in case you would like to go away and think about these after the event, but we're obviously not expecting you to do them actually as part of this workshop. Also, I should note about questions. We can answer questions either as we're going along, or there will be a section at the end for questions. So please do submit your questions on the Ask a Question tab. Where we can, as I say, we'll answer your questions as we're going along, but hopefully if we haven't addressed your question as we're going along, we'll be able to cover it at the end of this workshop. Okay, so we're going to start by just thinking about some of the background and the context to underpin the rest of this webinar. So all of the work that the Office for Students does is underpinned by the Higher Education and Research Act 2017. The key things that you can see here on the slide are some key areas and key duties that the OFS has to consider. So these are on every board paper that is submitted by the OFS, and we have to pay due regard to all of these things. There's a couple of these that I just wanted to highlight to you, namely the one that's highlighted here, which is about in all of the work that the OFS does, we have to promote equality of opportunity in connection with access and participation in higher education. There are also a couple of others that are of particular relevance to this area, and that is the first one about protecting institutional autonomy of English higher education providers, and also potentially ideas around value for money. So given the investment that we're making in access and participation, how can we be sure that this is the best use of money and is seeing the best outcomes for students given our investment and the resource being put into this area? So following on from the Higher Education and Research Act, we can think about the OFS Regulatory Framework. Now, the regulatory framework challenges us and also the sector to take a bold new approach to access and participation. The idea is that this will represent a step change in access and participation. When Chris Millward, who is the Director for Fair Access and Participation, says he speaks to the media and, for example, students, there's a really keen interest in this area, and actually they're really interested in our aims and ambitions being greater and actually seeing greater outcomes for students as soon as possible. And this is because while we know that there are more young people from underrepresented groups going to higher education than ever before, there are also more students going to higher education from some of the most well-off groups in higher education. So this means that if we want equality of opportunity, we need to really think about the gap between these groups. So we're looking for providers to really make faster progress in closing the gap to ensure equality of opportunity. So what are we looking for from an access and participation plan? Well, let's talk through some of these key bullet points on the slide here. So we're looking for an honest, rigorous and public analysis of gaps across the student life cycle. And that would primarily be in the assessment of performance section of the plan. And there's another webinar that will be covering this area. We're looking for universities and colleges to think about new objectives and targets towards reducing the gaps and improving practice in equality of opportunity by 2024 to 25. We're also looking for providers to have credible plans which deliver the targets that they have set out. So that we would kind of think of one of these as being one which has a clear theory of change throughout the plan. So the idea is that the assessment of performance underpins a provider's aims, objectives and targets, and then the strategy actually follows on from this, and that any activities or interventions that a provider decides to do are really evidence-based and linked back to a specific target group and objective that was highlighted in this aims, ambitions and targets section of the plan. We're also looking for there to be appropriate investment to underpin the strategy and the strategic measures a provider is taking, and we're looking to see good evaluation practice and continuous improvement in practice. We'll also be doing risk-based monitoring and intervention, and this means that providers who are deemed to be higher risk will face more scrutiny from the OFS than those that are deemed to be lower risk. So what does this mean for the aims, objectives and targets section of the plan? And in particular, what do we mean by ambition? Well, the Office for Students has set out KPMs, so key performance measures, for itself and the sector on key areas of relevance for access and participation. And you can find these on the Measures of Our Success part of the website, and in particular the participation KPMs. So this doesn't include all of the areas of interest in access and participation. It really only focuses on some core areas that we think are of particular relevance and interest to the sector. But depending on different providers and different provider contexts, each provider's aims, objectives and targets will look slightly different. So broadly speaking, these KPMs aim to eradicate unexplained gaps gaps between underrepresented students and their peers in the next 5 years, and to reach equality of opportunity in a generation, so broadly in around 20 years. So this should start to give you a steer on what the OFS means by ambition. But we have to really stress again that ambition, in terms of your aims and objectives and targets in your plan, will look different for different providers depending on your context. So we understand some of the challenges in achieving these access and participation goals. We understand that they are challenging. We understand that they do represent a real step change in this area. So we are offering more support to the sector to achieve these aims and ambitions than we ever have before. So some of the things that you might want to engage with to help you when writing your access and participation plan are highlighted on the slide here. So we have produced a dashboard that you can find on the OFS website that has loads of data around access and participation at a national and a sector level. We're putting on this webinar, for example. We're hoping to put some training videos on the web very soon, and you can engage with the app@officeforstudents.org.uk email address at any time to speak to an access and participation advisor. We are also introducing the Evidence and Impact Exchange, which will be a What Works centre, and you may be interested in contributing to that and helping make that a really useful resource for the sector. We are supporting collaboration with higher education providers, for example, through the National Collaborative Outreach Programme, which has in the region of £60 million of funding each year. And we are investing in the sharing of effective practice. So, for example, you can look on our website and see an A to Z of effective practice, which covers loads of different underrepresented groups and summarises some of the evidence around each underrepresented group to help you, in particular, with your assessment of performance. Right, so we're now going to move on to some common queries around targets. And the idea of this is very much to address some of the queries that we receive head on, so that for the rest of this webinar we can think about how you might go about achieving the aims, objectives and targets requirements as set out in the guidance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put forward a question and then I'll hopefully talk through the answer after that. And for some of these queries, we also have some supporting slides to illustrate my points. So the first query that sometimes we hear from providers is that actually ambitious targets based on the OFS KPMs are unrealistic, that it's hard to reach equality of opportunity, for example, eliminating the differences in degree outcomes for black and white students in 5 years. So the first thing to say about that is that we understand that there is a real challenge in this area, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't let that stop us. We've still got to try and achieve these. We believe that they are challenging key performance measures, but that they are achievable. And as I said earlier, we often hear from the media and students that actually we're not being ambitious enough in this space. So we understand and believe that this is really essential, both for individual students and also the economy. But one of the key things about this is that the level of change required won't be achieved by, for example, running an outreach project in isolation. It's really got to be a whole provider strategic approach, and therefore definitely has to involve governing bodies and senior leadership to really see the best outcomes for students. So the second query that we are going to talk about is that our senior leadership is not on board with the level of ambition, or something around our senior leadership are waiting to see how stringent the OFS will be about access and participation. Now, some of you listening to this webinar might be from senior leadership and actually disagree that that is not the case, but we do hear this as a query sometimes. So some important things just to note around this issue is that the access and participation plans are related to condition A1 in the regulatory framework, but also the risk that is allocated from looking at condition A1 will actually contribute to the wider provider risk profile, and providers who are higher risk will generally receive greater scrutiny from the OFS. And so, for example, we will be visiting some particularly higher risk providers. So it's definitely of interest of governing bodies and also senior leadership to think about this now and to use this as an opportunity, especially with the starting of 5-year plans, in order to set a high level of ambition and achieve the best outcomes for students. One of the key things about this cycle is that we're increasing plans to be 5 years. Now, there was some pushback about this from, for example, the government about making sure that providers are making progress in this space. So the fact that we have those longer plans really means that providers need to be ambitious over that 5-year period. So moving on to the next question then. So sometimes people say to us that it's difficult to be ambitious in targets because there are things that happen that are out of our control. If we're monitored on progress against our targets, I'm concerned about being too ambitious because the targets may not be achievable. So a couple of things just to say about that. So we have to think about condition A1, which is about the risk of a provider taking all reasonable steps to meet the commitments in their plan. Now, this is really important because this reasonable steps idea can allow you to be ambitious. So the idea is that when we are looking at whether a provider has met all the commitments in their plan, we will look at whether you have done everything you reasonably can to achieve those outcomes for students. Now, if you haven't been able to achieve the outcomes, but you have taken all reasonable steps to achieve those outcomes, then we can reasonably assume that it's actually something else that has impacted on the student outcomes, that is out of your control as a provider. So that's how, so for example, if there was a big government policy change or something along those lines that meant that affected outcomes, for example, with a raising attainment target, but that you can show that you have done everything in your power, and it's worth saying there is a high bar around this and a high expectation, then it can be reasonably assumed that you have met your commitments in the plan. Just a couple of other things to say about how we'll monitor progress against targets. So access and participation plan will form part of the monitoring, will form part of the wider OFS monitoring and intervention activities, of which some of these include audits and random sampling, wider financial monitoring, condition B monitoring, which is about overall outcomes for students, and things about enhanced monitoring and ongoing conditions of registration. For access and participation plans specifically, there will be an annual monitoring return, which is the impact report, and providers will always have the opportunity to comment on their progress against their targets. So we don't look at targets in isolation, we look at progress against targets based in your context. So we will be developing impact reports and will consult with the sector when developing what exactly these will look like. And these will be designed and tested with you and also with students. And the idea is that these are clear and concise and allow you to give that commentary and a narrative around whether you have met or taking all reasonable steps to meet the commitments set out in your plan. So the next query to move on to is, how do we deal with policy and data changes? So, for example, things related to the Augur review or graduate outcomes data changes, etc. So the first thing to say about this is we think it's important to push on with access and participation. There's a lot of uncertainty in these areas, and we think it's important to ensure equality of opportunity for underrepresented students. If there is a change required in an access and participation plan, providers can submit a request to vary their plan, so it's a variation of the plan. And where necessary, providers can choose to submit a new plan. Where these are sector-wide issues, so for example around the Augur or the graduate outcomes, we will work with you as providers to make sure you know what you need to do and by when. Moving on to the next question then, what do we do about targets from existing access agreements and our 1920 APPs if we want to change our strategic direction following a new assessment of performance? So we'll put this as a new FAQ on the website in a week or so. But just to clarify, that if you would like to take a new strategic direction, which means that you're not going to follow your old targets, you should state your rationale for this in your 2021 plan, and also restate this in the relevant monitoring annual return. One thing just to note about this is we will not accept a reduction in ambition overall. Right, moving on to the next question. How many targets are you expecting to see in an access and participation plan? When we look at some of the previous access and participation plans and access agreements, we can see that plans have previously included, for example, up to about 30 targets or so. As we move to 5-year plans, we're expecting to see much more strategic outcomes-focused targets, and then therefore we expect to see fewer targets than we have seen before. The number of targets will vary depending on the provider, but what we are expecting to see is that there are targets that relate to all the key gaps identified in the assessment of performance. Targets should really focus on where the gaps are the largest. For smaller providers where there is limited resource, this may mean providing a really clear rationale about how you have chosen to include which targets you have, and how you have come to the decision about where you are going to put your resource and what issues you are going to address if you can't address all of them. The next question is, what should the balance be between a provider's own targets and collaborative targets? And what kind of collaborative targets do we expect to see? So targets should primarily be focused on a provider's own gaps. So it's highlighted in the Higher Education and Research Act that access and participation plans are related to equality of opportunity in individual providers. However, we look very favourably upon providers who work collaboratively, and it may reduce our perception of risk if providers are working together to achieve outcomes. So collaborative targets may be included in addition to targets which address a provider's own gaps. There may be a whole different variety of collaborative targets that we can see, and it really depends on what exactly you're trying to achieve in your context. So these could be, for example, regional collaborative targets. They could be targets related to national collaborative outreach programme groups. They could be based on a certain type of provider, for example, where there are small specialist providers who would like to work together to address national issues, etc. The really key thing is that we're looking for outcomes-focused collaborative targets. The next question is, what do we mean by continuous improvement in targets? So I'm going to just have another supporting slide to go along with this. These graphs on the slides show trajectories over the 5-year milestones of targets and what may be acceptable and what we don't want to see. So the first target that you can see on the top left is a kind of linear trajectory that's increasing over time. So that would be acceptable as a target. We may also see in this second target along in the middle, so the top middle graph, we can see this kind of upwards trajectory over the milestones. And this may be, for example, where you are putting in changes following an evaluation. And that would also be acceptable. The key thing to say about this is that we would expect an overall high level of ambition from this kind of target over the 5-year period. If we look at the bottom left table, this is where there is an upwards trajectory that then levels off. Now this is acceptable only if equality of opportunity is reached. Where a provider already sees equality of opportunity in an area, so there's no gaps for a particular group, we would not expect you to include a target in this space, but you may want to monitor progress against performance for each of those groups to make sure it's not decreasing at any point. If we go to the middle bottom chart, we don't want to see any targets that are maintaining performance. And then if we go to the chart on the graph, say on the right-hand side, this may be acceptable in odd circumstances. So this might be acceptable where, for example, a brand new collaborative target or brand new raising attainment target is being put in place, and that there won't be any longer term outcomes for the first couple of years. In that instance, it might be best to contact us on the APP at officeforstudents.org.uk just to talk about your particular target and your particular situation and how best to address it. So one other query to talk about is the use of POLAR. So a key thing to say about POLAR is that it's an area-based measure looking at higher education participation. It's not a measure designed for targeting individuals. Best practice when considering any measures related to something similar to socioeconomic status is to use a basket of measures to make sure that no individuals are missed due to any data limitations. So this might include measures related to higher education participation, socioeconomic status, or household income, for example. What we ask for in the guidance is that first and foremost, targets should match where gaps are the largest. So where relevant, these should reflect the OFS KPMs, and some of the OFS KPMs tend to reflect the polar measure. But remembering that the OFS KPMs are not the only areas of interest in access and participation. Where there are particular limitations related to polar and the use of polar, providers can use another measure in addition to polar. So any measures that are used in addition to polar should be a measure of equality. They should be publicly available measures and therefore replicable. And it should be a measure which shows a comparable level of ambition to our OFS key performance measures. Okay, so one more common query that we're going to address is how to develop a raising attainment target. So I'm just going to bring us on to a new slide for this. Bear with me. Okay, so the guidance says that providers may include a raising attainment target. This is particularly relevant for providers who need to have longer-term strategic relationships with schools to generate more eligible applicants. So, for example, this may be the case where a provider is currently high tariff or is a specialist provider. Or it may be, for example, where providers are working with mature students who are, and they need to think about helping students to have the skills and knowledge required for access to higher education. So a couple of things, I just have to give a disclaimer about these slides. The slides include very simplified examples and diagrams, and these are really for illustrative purposes. It shows how you might go about developing a target of this nature if it is relevant to your context. So theory of change might be a good way to approach developing a raising attainment target. And the idea around this is that you actually kind of work backwards. So a longer term outcome would probably be related to access to higher education. So you could use, for example, access to higher education data as your outcomes in this area. So if we work backwards, we can look at evidence about what contributes to access to higher education, and these could form your medium term outcomes. So, for example, this could be about the measure on which provider selection is based. So it could be about academic qualifications such as GCSEs, because we know that GCSEs, and there is good evidence to show that GCSEs, there's a strong correlation between attainment at GCSE and access to higher education. Or it could be, for example, related to specialist skills and knowledge that is required for entry to a provider. So then working back from there, if we look at shorter term outcomes, there's a few examples of sources of evidence there that you could look at. For example, academic qualifications. The Education Endowment Foundation has a good summary of evidence about what factors contribute to improved GCSE outcomes. And you think about what factors are you actually trying to improve in the shorter term. So these could be related to teaching or leadership. They could be related to something to do with an individual student, or it could be about thinking about school characteristics that are associated with higher academic qualifications and where you may be able to contribute to those outcomes. So to put this into context, here's a few, as I have to say again, very simplified examples of this. And as I say, you really have to think about this in your context and actually what you're trying to achieve. So this is a common one that we can see on the slide here that was highlighted from some work that Neil Harrison did for us on pre-16 outreach evaluation. And there was this kind of logic chain. So it was the idea that increased chance of entering higher education is related to a stronger GCSE attainment, and as we know, there is good evidence to show that this is the case. But a lot of that was based on the idea that increased motivation would help GCSE attainment, and that actually raising aspirations would increase motivation for schoolwork. And actually, there's very limited evidence to suggest those two links. So it's just about being critical about what exactly you are trying to achieve. Now, here are some other examples of very simplified different theories of change you might be working towards. On the right-hand side of the screen, there's kind of longer or intermediate outcomes. And on the left-hand side of the screen is some of the shorter outcomes that you may be aiming to achieve. Now, what you can see is that some of these have different lengths of time in which they might be aiming to achieve things. So some of these interventions might be about 12 years, 10 years, and some of them may be within the lifetime of the plan, so 4 years. In a shorter program, or a program that's been running a long time, we may expect to see targets that are related to outcomes on the right-hand side of the screen. So, for example, around school attainment or access to higher education. If it's a longer-term program or a new program, then you may be looking to include a target based on the shorter or intermediate outcomes that are more on the left-hand side of the screen. So when you're developing a target, it really depends what you are trying to achieve with raising attainment, how long your program is, for you to decide which outcome, and all of these on the slide here are outcomes, which outcome would be best to include as a raising attainment target. Okay, so this, as I said, was one of the practical activities that we did in the workshop, and should you want to go away afterwards, this might be a good activity to do. It involved looking at the assessment of performance from, say, your 1920 plan or your recent data in order to inform your new access and participation plan. From this, you can then deduce your strategic aims, target groups, and measurable objectives. So if we just talk through what we mean by aims, objectives and targets in the access and participation plan. So aims, objectives and targets are the same as how they are commonly referred to in education. So your aims are really your higher level aspirations. So for example, it could be something to do with, we aim to create an inclusive learning and teaching environment in which all students, whatever their background, are able to achieve their full potential. So that's quite a generic aim. But it may be more specific to your certain context and remit. So for example, you could have a large proportion of mature students or children from military families, and you would like to consider this as part of your strategic aims. Objectives are how these aims will be achieved, and these should be time-bound. So how to go about this is in the template from your access and participation, for an access and participation plan that you can find on the website, there is a targets group section. And this should really be a summary almost of your assessment of performance. Which groups and at which stage of the life cycle are you going to target based on that assessment of performance? The objectives are then thinking about, for each one of these targets, at each one of the life cycle stages, what exactly are you going to achieve and by when? So this might be a period that is longer than the 5 years of the plan. So for example, we will eliminate the attainment gap between black and white students by 2000 and X. We will eliminate the non-continuation gap between Polar 4, Quintile 1 and Quintile 5 students by 2000 and X. The targets are put into the targets and investment plan, which is the Excel document, and these are statistical rather than written and in the actual written section of the plan. And the targets show what progress you expect to make towards achieving your objectives over the 5-year duration of the plan. And these targets should have milestones for each 5 years, and my colleague Dave is going to talk about that in more information shortly. Right, okay, so moving on. I'm just going to have a little look at the questions that we've had come in to see if we can answer any of these now, so bear with me just while we have a look through these. So there is a question around, if we don't have gaps related to the key performance measures, but we do have other gaps, would you still expect us to have targets for the key performance measures? We don't expect you to have targets for the key performance measures if these are not the areas of importance to you. So first and foremost, your targets should reflect the gaps that you have identified in your assessment of performance, and where you have a target that is related to one of the OFS KPMs, the measures, etc., should reflect the OFS KPM. So there is a question here about, can you clarify what we mean by improve student characteristics? And I have to admit, this isn't the best, that's not the best term perhaps to describe what we're talking about. It's just to distinguish between where we're talking about doing a program that affects an individual student versus running a program which, for example, affects school characteristics. So, for example, if you look at the Brilliant Club, they try to improve metacognition and overall student knowledge in student tests. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, there may be a whole raft of different things that you're trying to achieve, but it's really about the difference is, are you trying to influence an individual student, or are you trying to influence at a school level, etc. So this question is, we are not a selective provider and we have a high proportion of mature students. Would we still be expected to have a target based on raising attainment? You're not necessarily expected to have a target based on raising attainment. It could be a very credible thing to do if you do want to include a target on raising attainment. For you, if you're thinking about mature students, it could be, for example, around ensuring mature students have the skills and knowledge required for access and entry to higher education. So that may be a very credible approach and a credible strategy to increasing access at your university. There's a question about data benchmarking, but I'm going to leave that for my colleague Dave, if that's okay, for the second section. Okay, so I think that is all of the core. That's all of the core questions that we have for the moment. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Dave Hughes now to talk about how to write a good target. Please bear with us just while we hand over the microphone.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Dave Hughes. I'm a senior analyst here at OFS. And I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about how to write a good target from a data perspective. So just as a quick overview of the OFS's key performance measures and the targets that have been set for the OFS and the sector. So we've got 4 targets at the moment for our key performance measures. We're hoping to release a target for our key performance measure 1 later on in the year. And our targets, I'll just read them out and go through them very quickly, just so you've got just to kind of jog your memory. Key performance measure 2 is related to access, and this is, we're wanting to close the gap between access and participation between the most and least represented groups in terms of polar quintiles. So that's polar quintile 5 and 1. We want to close the gap between by 2038-39, and a sub-target of that is to look at reducing the ratio of the participation rates between polar quintile 5 and 1 from 5 to 1 to 3 to 1 by 2024-25. Now, in terms of student success, we have 3 targets, the 3 performance measures around this. The first of which is to do with continuation rates and non-continuation, and that's again to reduce the non-continuation rates between the most and least represented groups by 2024-25 in terms of the unexplained gap between these 2 groups, and I'll go into more detail about what that means in the next slide, so I can give you an overview of that. And then for the absolute gap, that's the overall non-continuation rate gap between the most and least represented groups by 2030-31. And then in terms of attainment, in terms of degree outcomes, we want to eliminate the unexplained gap in degree outcomes between white students and black students by 2024-25, and the overall gap by 2030-31. And similarly for disabled and non-disabled students, we want to eliminate the absolute gap in degree outcomes by 2024-25. So what do I mean by these unexplained and structural gaps? So let's take, for example, the Key Performance Measure 4, which is the gap in degree outcomes, which is the first and 2-1 between white students and black students. So on the plot there, you'll see that a historical gap has been closing slightly somewhat over recent years, and then thereafter we showed the composition of this overall remaining gap in 2016-17 as a combination of structural and unexplained. And for these two contributions, we have two different timescales associated with closing these gaps. So the way we measure this is we actually use statistical modelling at OFS to determine what is a structural and what's an unexplained gap. And it's a methodology that's currently in development, and we're keen to engage with the wider academic community if anyone has any input or thoughts on this. So what do they actually mean? What do the structural and unexplained gaps actually mean, and how can we explore them in our data? So the unexplained gaps, which we want to eliminate by 2024-25, are essentially the effect of unobserved factors that contribute to, say, attainment gaps. And these are the things that can't be seen in our data by data exploration or statistical modelling. And by statistical modelling, I mean in terms of unexplained, if we don't take a factor into account during our modelling, then it can't be explained by those factors that aren't included in the model itself. So for an example, if you're exploring your own data and you can't see this difference, so if you were looking at the attainment, say, in Key Performance Measure 4 between white and black students of degree outcomes, you may have very different degree outcomes despite your two populations of white and black students having the same entry qualification profiles, studying the same subjects and being the same age. So at this point, it can't be explained by those factors alone, and it would require further investigation by the individual provider at a local level to identify the root cause of these gaps, and there is no real one-size-fits-all solution. So in terms of what I mean by structural, is quite the opposite of that, or just the reverse even. The effect of these structural factors can be seen in our data when we explore it. So for example, do more students of a certain demographic study a specific subject or different subjects? Are the entry qualifications of different student demographics very different? So these are things you can tell between two populations that you want to compare, say, attainment gaps in, and you can see them in the data by exploring these particular factors. So in sort of summary, the unexplained terminology here specifically refers to the fact, by looking at the factors in the data, differences in attainment, for example, or gaps can't be explained by the variables we have. So now on to sort of how to create a target from a data perspective. Now, I've presented the OFS's KPMs for itself and the sector, and we know that they're very ambitious, and Elizabeth has outlined why they are ambitious and the levels of ambition we've set. So when you're setting your own target for your own local data and your own context, we expect these to be ambitious. And we also expect them to be based on an in-depth analysis and understanding of your data. And this is partly the reason why we released the Access and Participation data set, so you can explore the various attainment gaps for both your own provider and others, and also why we released back to you your individualized data. The targets must be outcomes-based. So again, that could be like access, non-continuation rates, attainment and progression. The target should be proportionate to the gaps you've identified. So for example, if we have a very small number of students, say 50, and we expect over a 5-year period, if you target for a very small decrease in the gap, then being quite a small population, we may expect a larger reduction of the gap to be achievable. The target should be numerical and replicable. So we should be able to reproduce these things with the data sources that you've specified used in creating your targets. And at the very least, we expect you to use the access and participation data set. Your target should consider structural and unexplained gaps, which would also be an indication to us of your thorough analysis of the data. And the structural and unexplained gaps, as I explained earlier, can be just explored by looking at the different basic factors affecting our different populations, such as entry qualifications, subject of study. And also these targets should contribute towards achieving the national access and participation targets in the OFS KPMs, if relevant. And I know Elizabeth addressed in a question earlier saying that if there were no gaps in where the OFS KPMs are set, then we do not necessarily expect you to set a target in that area. And they should also be set over 5 years and include milestones for every year of your access and participation plan. So a quick overview of the resources that are extremely useful that will help you to create your targets. There's plenty of information on the Access and Participation Plan website, the OFS website. And I mentioned as well that the data can be explored through the Access and Participation dashboard. And also a thorough read of Regulatory Notice 1 and Advice 6 released by the OFS earlier this year will give you lots and lots of information there to help you create good targets. So how do we actually write a good target? So as part of the interactive session that we ran previously, one of the tasks was to fill out a target and investment sheet based on creating numerical targets based on the workshop first part. So this was creating your new aims and objectives based on your 1920 APP. So the various fields in the targets and investments plan, first of which is the aim. So what do you want to achieve with this target, and is it outcomes based? So for example, our overall aim could be to reduce the attainment gap for students from underrepresented backgrounds. So within those underrepresented backgrounds, what do you mean? What group are you trying to target? So an example would be ethnicity. And then we want a description of the target, so a description of the statistic used to measure the progress of this target. So this could be the ratio of a percentage of or a percentage point difference in. So in the case of KPM 4, the OFS KPM, we could say that the percentage point difference in degree attainment between white and black students is our official target we want to change. Is this target a collaborative target? Is it being set as a part of a collaborative effort, i.e. between providers or different stakeholders? And is it to address national, regional or local priorities? So, what appropriate data source have you used to create these targets? And does it require further commentary from its use? So as I mentioned previously, the access and participation data set should certainly be your primary point of call on this to identify where your gaps may lie and what targets you should set. But beyond that, are there other further data sources that you might wish to use that are suitable for your own context? The baseline year. So we'd expect here the most recent year of available data to be used. In this case, for example, target that would be 2017-18. And the baseline data. So this is the statistic outlined earlier that's going to be derived from your data source, and it's the value against which performance is going to be measured in subsequent years of your access and participation plan. So yearly milestones. This is where we want to see target statistical values for, apologies, I think I was just on the wrong slide there. I've just seen, we just jumped ahead a little bit. So onto the yearly milestones. So this is the target statistic we want to see in the following years of the APP. And when you come up with these numbers, we want to see things like if you consider the time for planned interventions or actions to take effect. This is going back to the structural and unexplained gaps that we observe. Is the target ambitious and achievable? And if relevant, is it contributing towards the national targets as set by the OFS KPMs? Does the target consider the numbers of students in the target groups? So, for example, if we had, say, 10 students, we would expect more than a reduction in the target of 1% per year. This is what I mean by that. And have structural and unexplained contributions been considered and explored? And importantly, have you identified milestones for all 5 years of the Access and Participation Plan? And then the final field on the targets and investment sheet for target setting is the commentary on the milestones and targets. So now you've created the targets, the statistical targets. Is there any further commentary that's required around these values? So this example doesn't necessarily set out something that we may expect you to be filled in, but is more of a guide of the things you might want to think about once you've set these targets and created and filled in the numerical fields. So we've identified an area where an immediate intervention is predicted to have a large impact in the first 3 years of our Access and Participation Plan. And in the table below, you'll see that for the first 3 years, 2020 to 2022, we've seen a 5 percentage point decrease there. And that's what we expect from a given intervention for those first 3 years. Following on from that, having explored our data, we've identified that there are also structural factors contributing to attainment gaps, and the interventions we are implementing will take longer to have an effect. So you'll see again in the table below, from 2022 to 2024, you see a smaller reduction in the gap year on year, because you may have intervened in some way, for example, with outreach programs to raise prior attainment or this sort of thing. So also our target milestones are in line with those of the OFS and contribute to achieving the national targets. So again, this is the kind of thought process you may want to consider while setting these targets for yourself. So then part of the next practical activity we ran was to use the blank targets and investment plan provided to turn your objectives that may have been produced from the previous practical activity into correctly formatted numerical targets. And then to evaluate these with either yourself or with someone else to check whether they are formatted correctly and they can be replicated, whether all the information is there. Are they ambitious as they could be, and do your targets directly reflect the first 5 years of the objective and what your plans may be? And importantly, do they demonstrate continuous improvement? So that was a whistle-stop tour, really, of how to set targets using your data. So I think now we'll perhaps wait for a minute or two to see if there are any more questions to come in, and then we can run through the data-related targets. So I'll just give you a minute or two to send in your questions. Okay, so let's run through some questions now. We've got a question here that says, is our data benchmarked? So the focus of these targets is to close the absolute gaps in each individual provider, which will lead to the overall OFS KPMs being satisfied. So they are not benchmarked at the moment. It's up to you to decide and set targets in your own local context, and they'll be judged on that.
Okay, so we have a question here that is about kind of over-representation, if you like. So if there's a gap for KPM 1 and 2, but it's related to having high proportions of students who are not underrepresented, we would not expect you to include a target to close the gap in this instance. It's only where there is a gap this is not advantageous for underrepresented groups, but certainly it's beneficial to look to monitor progress over time internally within your own university or college. It's important to note that in this instance you're contributing to the national picture, and nationally there is underrepresentation of certain groups, so we certainly wouldn't want you to focus on reducing a gap that wouldn't work towards the national aims of equality of opportunity.
So there's a question here around to what degree can we assess our performance against other similar institutions? Is the only relevant yardstick for performance the national average, or is their performance in this subsector also relevant? So with the AMP dataset, you can explore other institutions and their performance in terms of targets, but the focus here is, of course, on your own institution and how you can make that work within your own context.
Right, there's a question here that was following on from one earlier about raising attainment targets for mature students, where there is not actually a problem with access for mature students. And so it's important to note that any university or college or any provider can have a raising attainment target if that is a key part of your strategy. So it's really about looking at what you are trying to achieve as part of your strategy, perhaps creating a theory of change or outcomes chain, logic chain, something like that, to understand and to communicate exactly what you are trying to achieve in your particular context, and then developing an outcomes-based target related to that. I think one of the key things to say about this is that we do expect you to have targets related to where you have gaps in your individual provider, but you could also include targets that are for the national good, and we look favourably upon providers who do this. So collaborative targets or raising attainment targets or long-term targets where you have sustained relationships with schools and employers, for example, could be a good target in this space. So it's really related to your strategy and your context. And it's the key thing is about communicating in the written section of your plan what you're doing and why you're doing it, and then creating a numerical target that's outcomes-based that matches that.
So there's a question here, just double checking about KPM 3, solely Polar 4, Quintile 5 to 1. It is that, yeah, it's the gap in non-continuation between Quintile 5 and Quintile 1 for Polar 4. So there's a question here around basically small numbers when you're talking about targets being proportional, and that they should be easy to increase, or when I was talking about the gaps in those. In terms of dealing with small numbers of students with gaps, say in attainment between two different groups, yes, you will be given the opportunity to justify the targets that you set. And it's one thing in the A&P dataset you can look at as well for yourself is whether there's a tab for statistical significance, and you can explore any gaps in there that will tell you if there is a statistically significant gap between two groups. Yeah.
Thanks, Dave. I'm just going to add something here, that the written section of the plans related to your aims and objectives should directly match your your targets in the targets and investment plan. So there should be a read across between those areas. So in the written section of the plan, you could have the opportunity there to give the rationale for why you have taken the approach that you have taken. If during the assessment process we have any queries about this, we'll come back and speak to you. Equally, if there are any issues around small numbers, and especially if you're in a small or specialist provider and you'd like to run something by us before submitting your plan, then you can contact app@officeforstudents.org.uk, or you can also book into a telephone surgery to talk through a whole series of queries about your access and participation plan, and the dates and how to book those are on our access and participation plan webpage.
So we have a question here about the methodology used to ascertain and identify structural and unexplained gaps, as I was trying to explain. So the methodology we use is full statistical modelling using regression analysis. But as I pointed out, obviously we don't expect all providers to do this. This is used as a guidance tool for us. What we will expect providers to do in the regulatory guidance, there are factors that are set out that we consider to be structural. And when I was talking about the difference between structural and unexplained, I mentioned if you look at two different groups where you may have an attainment gap, for example, and they have very similar entry qualification profiles and study similar subjects, but still have very different levels of attainment, you may regard that as unexplained by structural factors or the things that aren't different between them. So but the information contained in regulatory guidance 6 will tell you the sort of factors we treat as structural. So even just by basic data exploration, you can get an idea of where your gaps may lie. We are going to be publishing some FAQs on this as well, and there will be something in that in relation to the methodology. So we have another question here around treatment of gaps in terms of small numbers again, whether they're unexplained. Of course, with small numbers, it's very difficult, again, to come up with anything, but there is a guidance, again, in regulatory advice and the notice that we published around what data sources can be used in the event that you have very, very small numbers, sort of looking at maybe national statistics and how this may apply to you. But again, in the assessment and performance section in the written parts, discussing this sort of thing, even if you can't arrive at a solid numerical target for these things, is important.
A question here about the Excel file and how the columns with the targets relate to performance years, the kind of which cohorts each targets would apply to. Just to note on this that we will be publishing an FAQ within the next week that outlines more information for you on which kind of groups you should consider for each different type of target. So I should probably say that the FAQs on the website following the workshops that we had recently are going to be updated, so probably worth looking at that in a week or so. But there should be some clarity on that there. Right, so someone's just asked about kind of the role of investment, so the investment commitments in the plan and the link between targets and investment. I think the key thing to say about this is that we've removed a specific expectation of spend for providers, but that investment is a key measure of how credible a plan is. So have you put enough resource into achieving the strategy that you have put forward in your plan? And that's the question that we will really be asking. So given your level of ambition in the targets and aims and objectives, and given the strategy that you are planning to take in your context, have you outlined what investment you will be making to achieve those? And does it seem like a credible amount of investment? So that's how we're looking at targets and investments in the plan broadly. Right, so there's a question about if we don't meet a milestone, what will the impact of that be? So every year you will submit an impact report which will look at, in that you will look at your progress against the milestones that you've written in your access and participation plan, and you will have the opportunity to make a commentary on your progress against that milestone, and whether you have taken all reasonable steps to achieve the outcomes. So depending on somebody's asked about what the impact of that will be, it really depends on a case-by-case basis, and whether a provider has taken all reasonable steps to try and meet the targets that they've written in their plan as to what that would actually look like, and how we would engage with you after that. And if you identify new gaps, then you can certainly have a conversation with us about what that might mean for your plan and whether you'd want to submit a variation to your plan, etc. So in those instances, please do talk to us if you're unsure.
So just a question around the terminology used for our gaps. So the absolute gap is the total sort of the raw gap, as it were, that you measure purely from the data, and it's a combination. The total gap is the sum of the structural and unexplained. So when we say absolute and total or implied, we mean the total observed gap.
There's a question here about how much detail needs to be included about what type of interventions will be taking place. So the key thing to say about this is that the interventions are part of your strategy. So this will be outlined in the strategic measures section of the plan, rather than the aims, objectives and targets section of the plan. So the aims, objectives and targets section of the plan is really what are you trying to achieve and by when. The strategic measures are So given what you're trying to achieve, how are you going to achieve that? So this is obviously moving to 5-year plans. The plans will be much more strategic than perhaps they have been previously in 1-year plans. So in that instance, there might be a little less detail than there have been in some access agreements or access and participation plans before. What we don't want is a list of activities and loads of detail about what you're going to do. What we do want is to see how you have decided which strategic measures you're going to take. So why are you doing which interventions? How is this evidence informed? How are you going to check that it's working? How are you going to, in that respect, how are you going to monitor and evaluate your activities and interventions to check that they are having the desired impact? So that really is about the strategic measures section of the plan. I think in short, the interventions, there'll be less detail than perhaps there has been before. It will be a strategic level. We really want to know what objectives and outcomes you're looking to achieve with those, and how you've come to the decision that those are the right strategic measures to deliver. So there's a question here about the use of Polar 4 in London. So sometimes London providers say that there are limitations to the Polar 4 measure in London. We do ask that in your targets you include other measures in addition to a measure related to Polar, and you can include commentary around that if you would like to note that you are a London institution and that there are limitations around Polar, to give that kind of commentary. But certainly if you have gaps, particularly relating, for example, to IMD, which is indices of multiple deprivation, and your data analysis has shown those gaps, then certainly you can include that as a target in addition to a Polar target.
So we have a question here about KPN1, which is the gap in participation in higher education from the most and least represented groups. And what the ratio is in our KPN1. So the ratio in KPN1 is just the ratio of the participation rates, the average participation rates from Polar 4 Quintile 1 regions and Polar 4 Quintile 5 regions. So for example, if you had Polar Quintile 5, 23% participation rate. This is just an example, by the way. These aren't real numbers. And then Polar Quintile 1, you had 10%, the ratio would be 2.3.
There's a question here that says, where we have a gap which is the same as a national KPM, what is your expectation that our target would exactly reflect the national target by year, etc.? So the KPMs are a guide, and it certainly gives you a good indication of what our expectation is around your ambition. It does depend slightly on your context though, and we will have, when we're looking at targets and assessing targets in your plan, we look at the plan as a whole, we look at everything, we look at your context, we look at the data, we look at all of the targets that you're looking to achieve, and then make judgments based on that. So the national KPMs are really an indicator of the level of ambition that's expected from providers, but it's slightly more nuanced than that in reality, and that the targets may vary depending on context. And then just another clarification about the London and the use of Polar, and that providers in London do have to have a Polar target in addition to any other socioeconomic status, income or participation measure. Okay, so I think that's all the, there's one more question just come in. Sorry, well, there's one more question we shall just have a look at. Right, so there's a question about data for new providers, and I'd actually encourage you, if you're a new provider or a small provider or any provider who actually has a specific issue around their data in their particular situation, to email us on app@officeforstudents.org.uk, outlining your query, and we'll speak to you on an individual basis, given your context, to give you some advice about how to approach your access and participation plan. So I think that's all the questions that we have had in. So I hope that has been a very useful session for you. This will now be put on the web if you would like to refer back to it as well. And best of luck with your APPs, and should you have any queries before submission, then please do get in touch. Just a reminder that we do have the telephone surgeries. Please submit questions before the telephone surgeries for the best quality discussion with an assessor. And details about that can be found on the Access and Participation Plan website. So thank you very much. Goodbye.